October 12th, 1982. Outside the legendary Roxy Theater in West Hollywood, something unprecedented and deeply troubling was happening in the world of popular music. A crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered on the sidewalk along Sunset Strip, but they weren't there to celebrate or show the typical enthusiasm associated with a Michael Jackson appearance. They weren't screaming with excitement, pushing forward for autographs, or holding signs of pure adoration like the thousands of fans who usually mobbed his public appearances. Instead, they were angry, deeply disappointed, and they felt betrayed by the very person who had given them so much joy, pride, and inspiration over the course of more than a decade. Michael Jackson was inside the venue, preparing for what was supposed to be an intimate showcase of songs from his upcoming album, Thriller. Record label executives, music journalists, and industry insiders filled the small theater, all eager to hear what the king of pop had been working on. But outside, the people who had loved him first, who had grown up with him, who had supported him through every transformation from child to adult performer, were holding signs that cut deeper than any critic's review ever could. "Michael, remember where you came from," read one handmade poster. "Don't forget your people," declared another. But the one that would haunt Michael for months afterward was simple and devastating. "We got a beef with you." This wasn't the usual crowd of screaming teenagers or casual fans hoping for autographs. These were the day one supporters, the people who had been with Michael since the Jackson 5 days in the early 1970s. The black community that had embraced him as their own precious child, watched him grow up before their eyes on television screens and in concert venues across America, and now felt like he was systematically slipping away from them into a commercial mainstream world where they no longer recognized their hero or understood his motivations. This wasn't about jealousy or possessiveness. It was about cultural identity, community loyalty, and the fear that their most successful representative was abandoning the very people who had made his success possible in the first place. The tension had been building for months. Michael's recent musical direction, his collaborations with rock-oriented producers, his obvious attempts to cross over to mainstream pop radio, had created a growing divide between him and a significant portion of his core fan base. The whispers had started quietly in record stores, barbershops, and community centers across America, but now they had erupted into something much more public and painful. What happened next would become one of the most emotionally charged confrontations in music history, a moment that would test Michael Jackson's character, his loyalty to his roots, and his ability to bridge a divide that threatened to destroy the relationship between an artist and the people who had made him who he was. But to understand why nearly 200 of Michael's most devoted fans had turned against him, you need to understand the journey that had brought them all to this breaking point. Michael Jackson had been America's sweetheart since he was 10 years old. The youngest member of the Jackson 5, he had captured hearts with his innocent smile, his incredible vocal abilities, and his natural charisma that seemed impossible for someone so young. For the black community especially, Michael represented hope, pride, and possibility. Here was a young black boy who was not just accepted by mainstream America, but celebrated, beloved, and treated like royalty. Through the 1970s, as Michael grew from child to teenager to young adult, his fans grew with him. They had supported his solo career alongside the Jackson 5, cheered for his success, and felt a personal investment in his happiness and achievements. When he released Off the Wall in 1979, it was seen as the perfect evolution. Michael maintaining his soul and R&B roots while showing sophisticated artistic growth. But by 1982, something fundamental and deeply concerning had shifted in the relationship between Michael and his original supporters. Michael's new music was different in ways that went beyond normal artistic evolution. It was more polished, more commercial, more deliberately crafted to appeal to mainstream pop radio formats, and most troublingly, to many longtime fans. It seemed specifically designed to appeal to white audiences who had never given traditional R&B, and soul artists the respect, airplay, or commercial support they deserved. The producers he was working with, primarily Quincy Jones and his team of studio professionals, were creating music that seemed calculated to cross over to rock radio stations, adult contemporary formats, and suburban audiences that had historically ignored or actively rejected black musical artistry. The videos being planned featured elaborate productions that looked nothing like the performance-based videos that had defined black music culture. Most troubling to many longtime fans was Michael's physical appearance. The jerry curl hairstyle, the increasingly elaborate costumes, and subtle changes to his features made some supporters feel like he was trying to distance himself from his black identity to achieve even greater mainstream success. The breaking point came when word leaked about Billie Jean and Beat It, two songs from the upcoming Thriller album that seemed to confirm every fear his core fan base had developed. Billie Jean sounded like disco pop designed for white radio. Beat It featured rock guitar work and seemed like a blatant attempt to win over rock audiences who had never respected Michael's R&B origins. "He's selling us out," became the common refrain among disappointed fans. "He's forgetting where he came from." Social media didn't exist in 1982, but word spread quickly through community networks, fan clubs, and informal gatherings. The anger wasn't just about music. It was about representation, loyalty, and the fear that their hero was abandoning them to chase acceptance from people who had never valued black artistry in the first place. The protest outside the Roxy Theater had been meticulously organized by Marcus Williams, a 28-year-old social worker from Compton who had been an absolutely devoted Jackson 5 fan since 1970, when he was just 16 years old and had first heard "I Want You Back" on his older sister's transistor radio. Marcus had spent significant portions of his modest social worker salary on chartered bus transportation to bring supporters from South Central LA, Compton, Inglewood, and other predominantly black communities throughout the greater Los Angeles area to West Hollywood, determined to make their collective voice heard before Michael's exclusive industry showcase performance that would help determine the commercial trajectory of his upcoming Thriller album. "We're not here to hurt Michael," Marcus told a local news reporter that afternoon. "We're here because we love him, and we're scared we're losing him. That little boy who sang 'I'll Be There' meant everything to us. We need him to remember that." The crowd was remarkably diverse in age, background, and personal circumstances, but they were completely united in their deep emotional investment in Michael's career trajectory and their genuine concern about the direction his artistry was taking. There was Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson, 67 years old, a retired elementary school teacher who had saved up her money to take all 5 of her grandchildren to see the Jackson 5 perform at the fabulous Forum in Inglewood back in 1971, and who still had the concert ticket stubs carefully preserved in a scrapbook alongside newspaper clippings documenting every milestone in Michael's remarkable career journey from child star to global icon. There was James Rodriguez, 19 years old, a college student at UCLA whose older sister Maria had completely decorated their shared childhood bedroom with Michael Jackson posters, magazine clippings, and memorabilia throughout the mid to late 1970s, creating a shrine to their musical hero that had profoundly influenced James's own understanding of artistic excellence and black cultural pride. There was Reverend Thomas Anderson, a respected community leader who pastored a congregation of over 300 members and who had frequently cited Michael's music and success story in his Sunday sermons as a powerful example of young black excellence, discipline, and achievement, but who was now struggling to understand what message this apparent new commercial direction would send to the young people in his congregation, who looked up to Michael as a role model. As evening approached and industry guests began arriving at the Roxy, the protesters' chants grew louder and more emotional. "Don't forget your people," they shouted. "Remember where you came from." But the chant that stopped traffic and drew the attention of everyone within a 3-block radius was the one that captured their pain most directly. "We got a beef with you, Michael. We got a beef with you." Inside the theater, Michael was aware of the commotion outside, but was trying to focus on his performance. The showcase was crucial for Thriller's success. Record company executives needed to be convinced that Michael's new direction would pay off commercially. Music journalists needed to understand his artistic vision. Radio programmers needed to hear songs that would fit their formats. But the voices outside weren't just background noise to Michael. Each chant, each shout, each expression of disappointment felt like a personal attack on his integrity and his identity. These weren't strangers criticizing his music. These were his people, his community, his foundation questioning whether he still valued them. 20 minutes before his scheduled performance, Michael made a decision that would shock everyone in the theater and create one of the most powerful moments in his entire career. He walked outside. Security tried to stop him. His manager insisted it was too dangerous. Quincy Jones worried about potential confrontations that could damage Michael's reputation. But Michael had made up his mind. He couldn't perform for the industry while his own community stood outside feeling abandoned by him. The crowd outside fell silent when they saw Michael walking through the Roxy's front doors. Here was their hero, their icon, the person they had loved and supported for over a decade, approaching them directly instead of hiding behind security and management. Michael was wearing a simple black jacket and slacks, no glove, no elaborate costume, looking like the young man they remembered, rather than the pop star they were protesting. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence was thick with emotion, disappointment, and uncertainty about what would happen next. Then Marcus Williams, the protest organizer, stepped forward and did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of shouting or making demands, he simply said, "Michael, we love you, man, but we're scared. We're scared you don't love us back anymore." Michael's response changed everything. Instead of defensiveness or dismissal, instead of trying to explain his artistic choices or justify his career decisions, he simply said, "Can I talk to you? All of you. Not here in the street, but really talk." What happened next was unprecedented in the history of popular music. Michael Jackson invited nearly 200 protesters into the Roxy Theater, displacing industry executives and journalists who had paid substantial amounts for exclusive access to his showcase. He cleared the venue of record label representatives and replaced them with the people who were questioning his loyalty. The theater that had been set up for a polished industry presentation was suddenly filled with community members, longtime fans, and people who had never been inside such an exclusive venue. Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson found herself sitting in the same seats that had been reserved for Capitol Records executives. James Rodriguez was suddenly in the front row, where music journalists had planned to take notes for their reviews. Michael took the stage alone, without his band, without elaborate lighting or staging. He sat at the piano, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak in a voice that carried more emotion than most of his performances. "I want you to know," he said, his words echoing through the theater, "that everything I am, everything I've achieved, everything I've been able to do, started with you, with your love, your support, and your belief in me when I was just a kid from Gary, Indiana, who loved to sing." The theater was completely silent. Even the protesters, who had been shouting just minutes earlier, were hanging on every word. "I hear what you're saying," Michael continued. "I understand why you're scared, and I need you to understand something about me, about my music, and about why I make the choices I make." Michael began playing Ben on the piano, but slowly, intimately, like he was sharing it with family rather than performing it for an audience. His voice filled the theater with the same pure emotion that had made him famous as a child, but now it carried the depth and understanding of someone who had grown up in the public eye. "This song," he said between verses, "was written when I was 14. I sang it because I felt it, because I understood what it meant to be lonely, to be different, to need acceptance. That feeling hasn't changed. I still feel that way sometimes." The crowd was beginning to understand that this wasn't a performance in the traditional sense. This was Michael Jackson being more honest and vulnerable than he had ever been in public. "The music I'm making now," Michael explained, "isn't about forgetting where I came from. It's about taking where I came from and showing the whole world how beautiful it is. It's about making our music so undeniable that every radio station, every culture, every person who never gave us a chance has to listen." He transitioned into an early version of Billie Jean, but stripped down, acoustic, revealing the song's deep roots in funk and soul that would be obscured in the final production. "This isn't music for white people," he said as he played. "This is our music, played in a way that forces everyone to acknowledge how brilliant we are." Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson was crying. James Rodriguez was leaning forward, understanding for the first time what Michael was trying to accomplish. Reverend Anderson was nodding, recognizing the strategy behind what had seemed like betrayal. But Michael wasn't finished. He stood up from the piano and began speaking about something he had never discussed publicly before. The pressure he felt to be perfect, to represent his community while also pushing boundaries, to maintain authenticity while also growing as an artist. "You think I don't remember where I came from?" Michael asked, his voice rising with emotion. "I carry it with me every day. Every decision I make, every song I write, every time I step on stage, I'm thinking about the little black kids who see me and believe they can do anything. I'm thinking about proving that we belong everywhere, not just where people expect us to be." The theater erupted in applause, but Michael held up his hand to continue. "But I also know," he said, "that if you can't trust me, if you don't believe in me, then I've already lost. Because you're not just my fans, you're my family, you're my foundation, and I never want you to feel like I've forgotten that." What happened next has been described by everyone who was there as one of the most powerful moments in music history. Michael Jackson invited the entire crowd to join him on stage, not to perform, but to talk. For the next hour, he stood among the people who had raised concerns about his direction and listened to their fears, their hopes, and their dreams for what his career could represent. Marcus Williams explained that the protest wasn't about limiting Michael's growth. It was about ensuring that his success didn't come at the cost of abandoning the community that had made him possible. Mrs. Jefferson shared stories about what Michael's early music had meant to her grandchildren. Reverend Anderson talked about using Michael as an example of black excellence in his sermons and his concern that the new music would be harder to defend against critics who claimed it was selling out. Michael listened to every concern, acknowledged every fear, and then did something that surprised everyone. He announced that before Thriller was released, he would host a series of small performances in community centers, churches, and venues throughout predominantly black neighborhoods, showcasing the new music in intimate settings and explaining his artistic vision directly to the communities that had supported him from the beginning. "I want you to hear these songs the way they were meant to be heard," Michael said. "Not through radio or television, but live, with me telling you the stories behind them, sharing why they matter to me and why I believe they'll matter to the world." The crowd responded with enthusiasm, but Michael had one more surprise. He asked if they would be willing to hear "Beat It," the song that had caused the most concern among his supporters, not as a finished recording, but as he had originally conceived it. Michael began beatboxing the rhythm, but instead of rock guitar, he was creating the sound with his voice, showing how the song's foundation was rooted in the same vocal percussion traditions that had defined black music for generations. "This isn't a rock song," he explained as he performed. "This is our music wearing a rock song's clothes, showing rock audiences what real rhythm sounds like." The revelation was transformative. The crowd began to understand that Michael hadn't abandoned his roots. He had weaponized them. He was using his authenticity to infiltrate musical spaces that had excluded black artists, forcing acceptance through undeniable talent and innovation. When the informal gathering finally ended, nearly 3 hours after it began, something fundamental had changed. The protesters had become advocates. The disappointed fans had become excited supporters. The community that had felt abandoned now felt like partners in Michael's mission. But the impact extended far beyond that single evening. News of Michael's unprecedented decision to cancel an industry showcase in favor of a dialogue with concerned community members spread quickly through music industry circles and fan networks. The story was covered by Rolling Stone, Billboard, and major newspapers, but more importantly, it was discussed in barbershops, beauty salons, and community centers across America. The community performances Michael had promised took place throughout November and December 1982 in venues that major recording artists rarely visited. Michael performed in church basements, community centers, and small theaters, sharing his new music with intimate audiences and explaining his artistic vision directly to the people whose opinions mattered most to him. These performances became legendary among those who attended. Marcus Williams later described Michael's performance at a Compton community center as the most honest and powerful concert I ever witnessed. Mrs. Jefferson brought her entire family to see Michael perform at a South Central LA church, where he dedicated Billie Jean to everyone who ever felt like they had to prove themselves. The impact on Thriller's reception was immediate and profound. When the album was released in November 1982, it was embraced not just by mainstream audiences, but by the Black community that had initially expressed concerns about Michael's direction. The community performances had created a narrative of artistic integrity and cultural pride that counteracted fears about selling out. More significantly, Michael's willingness to engage directly with his critics had demonstrated a level of accountability and respect that was unprecedented among major recording artists. He had shown that commercial success and cultural authenticity could coexist, that crossing over didn't require abandoning your foundation. The protesters who had gathered outside the Roxy Theater became some of Michael's most vocal advocates. Marcus Williams started a fan club specifically focused on supporting Michael's artistic growth while maintaining connections to his cultural roots. Mrs. Jefferson became known in her community for defending Michael's choices whenever critics suggested he had forgotten his identity. Reverend Anderson incorporated songs from Thriller into his sermons, using them as examples of excellence, innovation, and cultural pride. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on Michael himself. The experience taught him that his relationship with his community required ongoing nurturing and communication. He couldn't assume that his intentions would be understood without explanation. He couldn't take for granted the support that had made his career possible. In interviews after Thriller's massive success, Michael often referenced the October night at the Roxy as a turning point in his understanding of fame, responsibility, and artistic integrity. That night taught me that being successful means nothing if you lose the trust of the people who believed in you first, he reflected. My fans aren't just consumers of my music, they're partners in my mission. The incident also influenced how other artists approach relationships with their core audiences. Michael's willingness to engage directly with criticism, to explain his artistic vision in personal settings, and to prioritize community dialogue over industry expectations became a model that influenced musicians across all genres. 20 years later, Marcus Williams, who had organized the original protest, was working as a music educator in Los Angeles public schools. In his office, alongside photos of his family and certificates from the school district, hung a framed picture from that night at the Roxy. Michael Jackson on stage, surrounded by community members, all of them engaged in conversation about music, artistry, and responsibility. People ask me if I regret protesting Michael, Marcus said in a 2002 interview. But that protest led to the most important conversation about art and community I ever witnessed. Michael didn't just listen to us, he changed how he approached his entire career because of what we talked about that night. Mrs. Dorothy Jefferson, who passed away in 2009 at the age of 94, had attended every Michael Jackson concert in the Los Angeles area from 1982 until his death. Her family found among her possessions a handwritten letter from Michael, thanking her for helping him understand that growth and loyalty weren't mutually exclusive. The Roxy Theater still hosts showcases for major recording artists, and occasionally when introducing new performers to industry audiences, someone will reference the night Michael Jackson chose his community over his career obligations. This is the venue, they'll say, where the king of pop proved that real artists don't abandon their people. They bring their people with them. Because that's what happened on October 12th, 1982. Michael Jackson didn't just respond to criticism from his fans. He transformed criticism into collaboration, disappointment into partnership, and conflict into one of the most beautiful examples of mutual respect between an artist and his community in music history. The signs that had read, "We got a beef with you," were replaced by new signs at every subsequent Michael Jackson concert. "We've got love for you, Michael." The fans who had felt betrayed became the foundation for even greater success, not because Michael ignored their concerns, but because he honored them. Sometimes the greatest test of an artist's character isn't how they handle success, but how they respond when the people they care about most express disappointment. Michael Jackson passed that test by choosing conversation over confrontation, understanding over defensiveness, and community over industry expectations. That night at the Roxy, Michael Jackson didn't just save his relationship with his core fan base and redefine what it means to be accountable to the people who make your dreams possible. He created a blueprint for authentic artist-community dialogue that would influence musicians for generations and demonstrated that true artistic integrity requires ongoing conversation between all artists.